Well, hello, everybody. I'm U.S. Senator Tina Smith, and I'm really happy to welcome you to another one of our Teas with Tina. And today is really great. Feels like a special day because we have an opportunity to be in a conversation with Qorsho Hassan, who has been just recently recognized as the Minnesota Teacher of the Year. Qorsho, thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you for having me.
I just really enjoy these conversations. They're really just sort of like we would be if we were able to be together in person, sitting across the table and enjoying a cup of tea and just visiting and getting to know one another a little bit. And so we'll just get going. And you and I, we haven't had a chance to meet in person yet. Would you just tell me a little bit about your family and how you became an educator?
So my family, both my mother and my father, immigrated to the United States in the late 80s. They found each other and married each other and decided to raise a family in Louisiana. And so my sister, Hada, and I were born there, spent a few years there, and then moved to Atlanta. And that's kind of where I was able to start school. And as a first grader, I was an English language learner because my mother spoke Somali at home. And so it was interesting to integrate into an English language environment.
Wow.
I was trying my best to like keep up and catch up with my peers. It helped because I was very talkative. So that just kind of lent itself to just me learning English and having those conversations with my peers. But I also wasn't able to really see myself in the educators that taught me. I was lucky that I went to a diverse school in Atlanta, but I couldn't identify with the teachers. And when my family then decided to move to Ohio, where I was primarily raised, we lived in a suburb that was mostly white. And so then my classrooms became different. I had mostly white peers, and I was oftentimes the only Black kid in the classroom. And so just having those experiences and not being represented in my learning, both in the curriculum and then as well as through my teachers, really just showcase the fact that we need more Black educators, and that's why I'm here.
Yeah, that's so, that's really interesting. Do you, as you were, as you think about the recognition that you've gotten, you're the first Somali American woman to receive the Minnesota Best, kind of recognition for Teacher of the Year, which is really, it's really a big deal. I mean, it's something that I know that educators really value and all of us really value. What do you think the meaning is? What do you think it means? I mean, how do you kind of put context around that, being a woman and a Somali educator?
It's very layered, I would say. And,
lots of intersections, right?
Powerful intersections that I'm proud of, but often are marginalized in our society. And so I am aware that while it's I'm being exceptionalized, right? I'm considered the best or the most competent educator in our state, but I'm also aware that this is a representative award. So I am taking it on the behalf of educators in our state, but I'm also representing my Somali community that I'm very proud of to be a part of, and I'm also representing my Muslim community. And so, but that comes with its challenges, right? Because I, as a probationary teacher, was released this school year from my district, and that is because of seniority and last in, first out, and those quality blind policies hurt me and hurt people who look like me that need to be in classrooms. And so it's a double-edged sword. And so while I'm grateful, I also want to use this platform for some change.
I've talked to a lot of women leaders of color who describe what you're describing, that kind of challenge to figure out how to be yourself while also bearing, in some ways, it's bearing the burden of representing a group. This is something that, to be honest, this is something that white women don't have to do as much because we don't have to feel like we're representing all white women. Could you comment on that? How do you see that?
So once again, multi-layered, right? So while I'm
Right.
proud to represent my community, the Somali community, the Muslim community, women, I also am myself authentically and proudly. And so I don't see myself as the mouthpiece. I see myself as an amplifier. So I make sure that I am taking my students' voices and marginalized communities' voices to the forefront of conversations that I have with leaders, to make sure that I'm not just speaking from my experiences, but I'm making sure that there is diversity within diversity in the stories that I'm sharing.
So as an educator, what keeps you awake at night? What do you wake up in the middle of the night thinking about or worrying about?
So many things lately. This week,
I wake up worrying about a lot of things these days, I can tell you.
So this week, which is a workshop week for my district, I've been thinking a lot of where I'm going to be. So my grade level that I was hired for was 4th, but that wasn't guaranteed considering I'm once again a probationary teacher for the 3rd time in my 8-year or going into my 9th year of teaching. So worrying about that, worrying about the safety protocols that are not in place but really should be in place to have a safe reopening for our students, and then just thinking about my students who are going to struggle with distance learning and virtual learning because they don't have the support at home from family, and that is due to several reasons, but just thinking about how to serve them equitably.
Yeah, I'm so worried about this in this moment. You know, I've had conversations with teachers all over the state who, as we were grappling with this pandemic, of course, teachers want nothing more than to be back in your classroom with your students and are so concerned about your students, but also on the other hand, feeling like if that happens, that it has to be in a safe way, safe for your students and their families, safe for you and all of the other public servants that work in public schools. And it's a very painful and uncomfortable place for teachers to be in this moment because of the lack of clear understanding about what the circumstances are. And I'm so frustrated by this because I think that the federal government should be doing so much more to support teachers and schools and school districts by getting you the resources that you need to do this really hard job, especially in the midst of a pandemic.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that starts with fully funding schools. I think it's
Yes.
ridiculous, but not surprising to hear that some teachers are buying their own PPE. And I think that goes back to, well, in the beginning, we're buying our school supplies and we still are. And so it's disappointing that we are reopening without thinking about the resources that we've needed from the jump, that our school supplies, the basic bare minimum, right? That we have put that burden on educators, but then now thinking about like, well, are we going to provide just one mask for the entire school year, or one bottle of hand sanitizer, or it's just, there are a lot of pieces to think through. And I think to reopen just to say that we are reopening is not okay.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I've spoken with teachers for years who have told me about how they pay for supplies out of your own pocket and do everything that you can to make the classroom work when you don't have the resources that you need. I was in Hibbing, Minnesota, I guess it was probably almost 2 weeks ago now, and heard an art teacher describe for me how she always buys supplies for her art class. But now with COVID, she's faced with, do I need to buy like 5 sets of supplies because it's not safe for my students to share supplies? How does that work? It's just, and so it's just particularly terrible, I think, that the Trump administration right now is trying to say, oh, well, we will support schools, but only if you agree to fully reopen, when that it's the costs and the consequences of that are just not taken into consideration. I think it's so irresponsible.
It is. And I also think it makes me reflect on schools that have never been fully funded or are nowhere near close to being fully funded, where students of color are really the victims of those systems, and they're inequitable, they're racist. And so just thinking far beyond COVID, like what are we going to do differently to ensure that all students are receiving quality education, and we're gonna take some time to address the racism that is rampant in our country and how it shows up in policies, and how it affects our kids of color and our communities of color.
Yeah. I so agree with that. I think all the time about the signals that we send our children, the messages that they receive when they walk into school buildings that are in desperate need of repair, into classrooms that don't have the supplies and the equipment that they need. When Black and Brown and Indigenous students walk into those classrooms, they get a message about what the world is telling them about their own worth and their own humanity. And that's such a, that's the racism in the system.
It is. And I think we have to address that alongside addressing getting PPE for all educators and making sure that we are protecting them and not using them or thinking that they're disposable masks.
Yeah, yeah. You were talking earlier about something that I also think is really important, which is the value of a student in a classroom seeing themselves in the teachers that are in the classroom with them. Could you just talk a little bit more about that and sort of how you experienced that when you were a young learner yourself, and now how you experience that as a woman educator of color?
So growing up in my home, I was proud to be Somali. I was proud to be American, and I was Somali first because that was the culture that my mom had taught me and the language that my mom had taught me as well. And so I remember just feeling proud to be Somali and to have that rich culture and that background, and then feeling defeated when I walked into school. I didn't see myself represented in books and curriculum or the educators that were teaching me. And so I just felt like I couldn't be my authentic self. I had to either be invisible, even though I was really hyper visible, or just exist and just try to get by. And even if I'm noticed, that I just take it and just go. And so I've been passionate about making sure that every child is seen in the classroom and that their background is an asset no matter what. Like if they are coming in speaking Spanish and that is the only language that they know, I'm not going to make them feel bad for that. I'm going to empower them because I think that that's a skill, and it's beautiful that they have that rich culture and that background. And so just being really mindful of our students and not labeling them with deficit language that is harmful because of their lived experience, right? A lot of times ELs are referred to as these learners who struggle with language, and instead of looking at them as emergent readers or emergent scholars. And so I think we really have to be critical about the language we use to attribute our students, because they know, they sense that, they can tell if they come into a classroom space that is receptive of them or the exact opposite. So that's what I try. I try to rewrite my own educational experience in my classroom every day. I
mean, you're talking about how important it is that students, that learners can be their full selves in a classroom, and to be respected for who they are and all the parts of who they are, and not sort of categorized or classified. I mean, which to me is essentially the essence of racist systems, where you are just assumptions are made about you because of the color of your skin. Right. Or what your gender is, or what your family background is, and breaking through that is really hard because the system is so built. Those sort of assumptions are so built into the way that people are young learners, people are treated. And I think to me that this is why it is so important to have diverse teachers in the classroom to start to overcome this. The system has to change too, but that's part of it.
Yes. And I think, I'm grateful to have this little cohort of Black educators in Minnesota. And we really connect on the fact that as we are in a marginalized system, we are trying to be mindful and hopeful that we don't want the same for our students, right? And we don't want the same experiences mirrored 20 or 30 years for our kids. Right. And so it's hard. It's at times, like I said, defeating. And even now as a probationary staff member here at 196, I potentially could have lost my classroom. Like I could have been pushed or bumped out because this is my first year yet again. And so just keeping in mind that we have these quality blind policies that need to be disrupted, they need to be changed, and not just for our students of color, but our white kids. The research shows the impact that Black educators have on them, and how powerful those experiences are into breaking down walls and barriers. So we matter.
Yeah, that's such a great point. We too often, I think, we sort of assign responsibility for dealing with and addressing systems of inequity to Black kids and Black teachers, rather than thinking about the benefits of all communities. It's such a really important point. As you were talking earlier about the impact of language on how we think about and address challenges and the sort of language of deficit, I have often thought about this in my personal war against using the language around achievement gaps. Because to me, we need to address the reasons why Black children are not doing, struggle to have the same opportunities that other children have, and not talk about that as an achievement, which seems to me like it's sort of a failure on the part of the individual, rather than a failure on the part of the system to provide the opportunities equally.
Yeah, I think it puts a burden on communities of color. It places the blame on them. And I also feel like all of this rich data that showcases the opportunity gap, whether it's dropout rates, whether it's MCA, like those clearly show that there are disparities when it comes to quality education and who receives what, and the have and have nots. But there is yet to be any true reaction and or policy to make sure that some change happens, and that our students are receiving quality education not based on where they live, and how much their school receives in terms of funding. So I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, this is part of the reason why I am so determined to get the federal government to live up to its promise to fully fund IDEA. Special education, because that is the federal government's failure to live up to that promise has put such undue pressure on school districts all over the country to try to provide the equal quality education that all children deserve.
And I think even within that, we have to recognize that a lot of kids of color have been identified as special ed by white educators who haven't taken the time to understand their culture or their background or their lived experiences, and why they might be misbehaving in the classroom and or reacting differently than their white peers too.
Yes, and you can see the impact of that. It's so true.
It is
so true. Well, we just have a few more minutes, but let me ask you, in my experience, teachers are realists, but you are also optimists. You kind of need both of those characteristics in order to get up every day and go into that classroom. So tell me what gives you a sense of optimism in this moment.
Meeting my students. So I'm now a part of a new school community here at Echo Park, and I am thrilled to meet my classroom. The demographics of the school is really diverse, and so I'm eager to meet my students of color. I'm eager to meet all of my students and connect with them and build community. This year will look different for all of us. And I think as I juggle being the Minnesota Teacher of the Year, as well as a fourth grade teacher at a new school, teaching new curriculum, I'm looking most forward to just meeting my students and their families and getting to know them and just building those authentic relationships.
Yeah, that's I love that. Do you find how do you sort of figure out how to build those relationships, not only with students but also with their families?
Oftentimes it's really just the environment, right? If they walk in and feel like they're welcomed and they belong no matter what, I think that just sets a tone, makes them vulnerable. And I have to really model that vulnerability. I'm honest with my students, and I've learned to be honest. It didn't come to me naturally. And I think oftentimes with teacher training, we're taught to manage classrooms and not really get to know our students as individuals, right? So just creating that climate of you belong, this is a safe space, and I want to get to know you for who you are, and I want you to get to know me for who I am with all the flaws, and just reality.
Yeah. it sort of makes the point, which I think is so important, is the way that civil society functions is when there's a fundamental level of trust between people. And I think it's one of the challenges, the deep kind of one of the most corrosive things that that Donald Trump is doing in this moment is just eroding that sense of trust between people. And so there in your classroom, you are sort of being an antidote to that corrosiveness every single day.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to not just blame one person. I know Trump has a lot of power as our president, which is hard to say that he is our president, but I also know that our country has 400 plus years of eroding that trust and making communities difficult for people of color. And so I think it's really important to highlight that our country is based on white supremacy, and that's not the fault of one person. He is definitely fueling that fire for sure, but there are several policies and systems in place to make sure that the status quo remains the same.
Right, yeah. It's so true. I think, I don't struggle with this, but I think about this all the time, how to bring a sense of both urgency and patience to this fight that we have. Urgency in the sense that we need to, in this moment, where I do believe there is a real reckoning and recognition of the great racism and inequity in our community, to kind of move that forward with great urgency, but also to understand that this takes patient and tenacious action. It can't be resolved by one election or one action or one piece of legislation. It's something that is going to require patience as well as urgency.
Yeah. And it's been a hard year, but I am grateful in some sense of the word that we are able to see the reality of not just what we're experiencing in silos, but like what communities of color are experiencing and have experienced for several generations. And I think it's also important to note for educators is that like a lot of us woke up due to this pandemic and George Floyd and realized that our students have been experiencing little pandemics or, just situations like homelessness and food insecurity and mental health crises in their lives. And then this is now exacerbated because of COVID-19 and George Floyd and the reckoning that's been happening. And so just being aware and cognizant of that and being an actionable leader, I think equity is a buzz term now. And I am glad that it's now a buzzword, but I'm also like, there needs to be some action rooted in just saying that word and realizing that we need to show up for our students and we need to show up for our country, and things have to change. Yeah.
Yes. Acknowledgement is an important step, but it is only the first step. And I believe that so strongly. Well, Qorsho, thank you so much for joining me today. It's wonderful to have a chance to visit with you. And I'm really, I respect so much your leadership and the work that you're doing. And I hope we can continue this conversation.
Thank you. I hope so too. Thanks for having me, Senator Smith.
Thank you so much. And for those of you who want to figure out how to continue to be involved, I would ask you, if you wanted, if there's more that you want to do, I ask you to go to mobilize.us/Team Tina, and you'll find all sorts of ways that you can get more involved. Thank you very much, everyone. See you soon. Bye, Qorsho.
Bye.